The title of this panel, Mineral Mavericks, and that's what we're going to talk about today, critical minerals here in Africa, but also what that means for multilateral relationships, but also relationships between the North and the South. So looking at current multilateral trade discussions in Africa, they are increasingly centered around retaining the continent's resource value chain within the borders of Africa. So it holds 30% of the world's mineral deposits, but 70% of those materials are sent to either Europe or Asia for further processing. This actually constitutes 70% of Africa's total exports. But that also means that there's really important conversations that are currently being had about how Africa can capitalize on these new industrial opportunities by processing these raw materials internally, thus transitioning, I think, into a net exporter of refined products. And this also brings in important conversations, like I mentioned before, about multilateralism, about the global North and the global South, about Europe, the United States. And so certainly no shortage of things to discuss today. I wanted to start the conversation, Ambassador Motsepe, with you. I mean, your position, not just as the founder of one of the largest mining companies here in South Africa, but also as the ambassador for South Africa for the Pan-African Parliament representing 55 nations. You have an interesting view, not just on the key geopolitical and geoeconomic drivers behind this global demand for critical minerals, but also how this has been playing out in both South Africa and amongst African countries. So could you please kick us off by giving us your scene setter on where we are today?
Thank you. Thank you. President Mbeki spoke this morning, and when he's opening presentation, he spoke about the road he traveled, and then he reminded us about the fact that this country, the place that we are today, is actually the hotel where he came to in 1991 in South Africa. And at that time, South Africa had no black people in mining. I was the only one. I started in 1986 as the first black producer in Africa and the world, to go more than nearly 4,000 meters underground to extract minerals on a contract mining basis, building for the big mining houses. And from there, owning a company like that, started owning mines as I was pursuing. But the issue here is, when you look at the African continent, we at that time had just, after 4 years of 1991, when he first came to this hotel, we then became the new South Africa in 1994. And by so doing, we then were politically liberated and also economically also liberated as a country, but not as a country's people. But when you look at Africa, Africa has been going through political liberation for many years. I was the guest speaker last year as the keynote guest at the mining indaba in DRC. Now, DRC was liberated in 1963. And before I spoke, I said, Minister of Mines and the Chamber of Mines President, how many people in your country own mines? They said, no one. I said, what? They said, yes. I said, wait a bit. Are you telling me there's no person in the DRC that owns mines? They said, no. And I said, can I just then, will you allow me not to talk about the topic that I was supposed to talk? Will you allow me to talk about the road we've traveled in the country that I'm from? And then I said, the DRC is very rich with cobalt, lithium, nickel, and all the energy minerals that are so uniquely needed for the world for the world's energy. But also over and above that, we also have nuclear minerals, because you find that uranium creates nuclear. And that's also another critical mineral, because nuclear power is the name of the game. And then you also have phosphate. Phosphate is another very unique mineral, because that's why Africa is saying to Ukraine and Russia, please stop the war. Because if the war continues, the phosphate that comes, that creates fertilizer for the African continent. The phosphate that is extracted from the ground is used for fertilizer, and the poorest of the poor will not be having access to any phosphate, and then the world will continue having the refugees from Africa in Europe. Is that what we want? I don't think so. So what are we going to do? You find that President Trump has said that he's going to stop the war, and he's also said that he doesn't want wars and all that. So, like he said that he was going to build a wall in America and build the wall, I hope that he will be able to stop the war so that we stop the war between Russia and Ukraine so the phosphate can come to Africa. So we can stop the war between Israel and all the other countries, especially Iran. Is Israel the proxy for America to fight Iran with these missiles? And then we're going to maybe have a third world war that might become a war of nuclear war. Maybe, maybe not. So what are we going to do, we the Africans, with our critical minerals? Are we going to continue allowing ourselves just to be the producer of the minerals, exporting the minerals offshore, and making the offshore countries being the owners of the mineralization or creating the end product? Look at what's happening to China. China created a unique manufacturing capacity in their country. And now China has infiltrated Africa in a very unique manner. China is our family in BRICS, and I have no problem with China because I was also a part of the BRICS Business Forum. And I want to salute President Mbeki during his leadership. He really made sure that South Africa became a member of BRICS in a very meaningful manner. And I was one of the BRICS Business Forum members representing South African BRICS. Now, what China is doing that is very strategic, they are entering Africa, making sure that in DRC and all the other African countries, they take control of the strategic minerals. While America was busy fighting with Trump, and the UK was busy fighting with Boris, and then from there, a woman was the prime minister for 3 weeks and no more there. So I'm just saying, while the Western world is sleeping on the job, China's doing infiltration to Africa in a meaningful manner. But are we saying, are we going to now becoming economically colonized by China? Are we going to allow China to partner with us so that we can allow China to say, fine, we are now the owners of these minerals. Before you can come and have our minerals, come and have your manufacturing plants here. You'll get the mineral cheaper. Not only will you get it cheaper because you're creating the end product in our countries, you'll also be able to export it cheaper, and then we can create a second industry because we are now only countries that are exporting ore in the raw material form. And now once more, I want to say, I salute you, President Mbeki, because during your time, you inherited South Africa from the new South Africa. From the old South Africa and new South Africa. You had to change the laws of the country as the president. Mandela was very effective as being the rainbow maker and the uniting the country because we needed that. And changing our brand offshore. He went a lot throughout all the countries. But during the time when President Mandela was going from country to country, promoting the image of South Africa, to allow us not to be sanctioned anymore, because South Africa was sanctioned, President Mbeki was running the country as the deputy president. And then from there, he became the president. But what President Mbeki did, he employed the ministers that were going to make sure that if you want a license in South Africa, a license in mining, a license to own a bank, a license to own a manufacturing plant, to manufacture anything, you must make sure that there's a charter and a BBB code. And we in the mining industry started changing the law. And I then created the Junior Mining Chamber because when President Mbeki was the president, 83% of the resources of the world, of our country, belong to 4 companies, Anglo-Val, De Beers, and Goldfields. So it was very necessary for us to nationalize the ownership of the minerals underground, like every country in the world. South Africa was the only country where 4 companies owned 83% of the minerals. So we call it the custodian of the minerals. The state became the custodian of the mineral rights, and whatever is on top of the ground are mining plants. It belongs to the mine. But anything that comes out, you take it out on a lease from the country. Now, what has happened? Coupled with that came the laws that says, in the mining industry, make sure that there's broad-based ownership. 5%, not less than 5% to rural communities, not less than 5% to your workers, not less than 20% to the broad-based business. So to date, what I did, we did a research where I then asked mining analysts to have a look at the country to see whether the charter laws have been actually achieved so far. So in 2004 and 2014, the charter had 10 years. So they did a research of 49 listed companies in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. There were more than 49, but we just looked at the JSE. The market cap at that time for those 49 listed companies by 2014, when the charter was implemented in 2004, was 2.574 trillion. And those 49 companies each had a black company that owned at least that time 26%. The market cap was 669 billion. Now, how can the DRC tell me in 2023 that they were liberated in 1963, and by so doing, in 2023, no DRC person owns a mine? They don't have a charter, they don't have a triple B code. And I'm appealing to you, President Beki, you and President Obasanjo created the African Union Parliament. It will be very important for us to make sure that the Parliament gets implemented. A lot of the times we had the former Prime Minister from Mali speak about we need to talk, we need to make sure that we stop complaining as Africa. But African Union Parliament, every country, or the 55 countries in Africa, has 5 members representing their country. Some countries have former heads of state, former prime minister. They're not just ordinary people. And that is where these issues can be articulated. That is where we have to have the next workshop with the African Union Parliament of this kind, with the Mbeki Foundation, hopefully, starting it. So that we can say, you and Obasanjo were the catalyst that created the Parliament. How can we pursue a terms of reference? A terms of reference that they're going to say, the neocolonialism that we might be encountering through the countries that are strategically very endowed with the manufacturing capacity in their countries, with the money that can come to our countries and make sure that they own the minerals, with us just exporting the minerals offshore, beneficiation must happen in Africa. And by so doing, let us make sure that we unite in the global south and let the Parliament of Africa look at the committees of Parliament and see how we can let our Parliament committee chairs inculcate the triple B codes and the charters to come and have a terms of reference. When you come to the African Union continent and you want to invest, there must be terms of reference of ownership, there must be terms of reference of beneficiation, there must be terms of reference of making sure that the strategic minerals are not going to become just minerals that are just going to be exported and the end product not going to be manufactured, and also, especially, making sure that Africa can pursue its individualistic growth by not being new colonized, because economic, political colonization is all conquered, but we run into the risk of being neo-colonialized. Economic colonization must not happen. The Francophone countries that are still paying royalties to France, are they? And why are they? African Union, why are we not talking about that in the African Union Parliament? Why should the French countries still pay royalties to France, those countries that have been colonized? Those are the things that we must unpack. And then we spoke also in BRICS about the dollarization and the SWIFT. Is the dollar still going to be the denomination currency of the world, or what are we going to look into? And the rating companies, are we still going to continue being rated by other countries? So these are the things that I think, President Beki, we should also bring to the African Union Parliament. And I'm asking you, can we have then the next session in partnership with the African Union Parliament so that we can pursue what we are saying today? Let us talk, let countries talk. We can talk in one room, 55 countries in the Parliament of Africa. They go back to their countries, they tell the ministers and the presidents what to do and what not to do.
Thank you so much,
Ambassador.
Ambassador.
Thank you very much for bringing me here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sean, I wanted to hop to you next because the ambassador made some excellent points that I think that we can build on. Looking at your position at the Sequoia Foundation, you've written about and have talked about green industrialization in some of the world's major economies and how that impacts demands for critical minerals. Can you talk a little bit about that and then sort of bring it south a little bit and talk about how Africa can position itself to benefit from this trend that we're seeing in major developed economies?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks to ORF for having me here today. Maybe just a quick 30 seconds on Sequoia Climate Foundation. So we're a US-based climate philanthropy with climate mitigation as our North Star. We fund think tanks, academic institutions, broader civil society actors on those topics, mostly on policy and regulation. We have no affiliation with Sequoia Capital, as I always like to say. I sit in our finance, economics, and trade team, where we've been focused on using this green industrialization sort of priority across many of the world's major economies as a mechanism to drive more capital and more investment into emerging markets and developing economies. We've seen delays, political challenges with the COP process around finance and other multilateral mechanisms to drive finance into emerging markets and developing economies. And I think there's a real opportunity now, given the importance of supply chains and critical minerals, to use that to incentivize and drive more financing from the US, from Europe, from Asia, and so on into resource-based economies. And this is driven by energy security, economic competitiveness, and defense priorities that cut across many political divides we see in the US and Europe and elsewhere. And as a climate organization, it's been very exciting for us to observe this trend and the focus on public subsidies and tax incentives going into clean technologies. And overall, I think this is going to drive increased competition in terms of clean tech production, providers of capital to companies, to countries that are well endowed in terms of critical minerals, and scale the overall supply of clean products and increase diversification, all of which I think are net public goods. But outside of China, it's been pretty slow in terms of major economies providing this investment into Africa and countries with a lot of critical minerals. And we need to deploy sort of newer, deeper, more catalytic financing arrangements that meet the sort of political needs, I guess, of some of the richer countries with the demands in Africa. And what we've seen is some efforts by the G7 through the JETPs, through the Climate Club, through PGII. They're well-intentioned initiatives, but they've not necessarily translated into financing on the ground. And so I think we need to rethink in terms of what are the right ways of getting, not necessarily going into these governance-heavy processes with a very broad scope and that don't necessarily focus on the actual financing on the ground. Over the last 20 years, we've seen Chinese investment into Africa go up fourfold. U.S. investment into Africa's gone up 4 times as less as Chinese investment into Africa. And we are seeing some promising signs. We've got the Mineral Security Partnership, the Quad, AUKUS, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and so on, that are much more targeted and narrowly defined initiatives that are bringing DFIs, export credit agencies, actual providers of public finance into the room. And so it's not just a kind of politicized conversation, as well as countries like Congo, Zambia, Namibia, as equal players around the table. President Biden is visiting Angola next week, I know, to engage with the work on the Lobito corridor and the progress there. So I think overall we can expect more competition around demand for critical minerals, which is a net positive for Africa, the ability to negotiate with multiple players, play them off against each other and really negotiate a better deal. Whether that's China, India, Gulf states, the G7, or whoever else. And I think hopefully that can counter some of the debt distress problems we've seen in Zambia and elsewhere, and learn some lessons from that. So maybe I can just conclude with five quick areas of focus. First, learning the lessons of the past. Why have some of these political grand strategies not necessarily delivered financing on the ground? I mentioned a few earlier. We need to avoid the temptation of just recreating new initiatives, new frameworks, and so on, and focus on actual mechanisms to move money on the ground. Second, spelling out what it would take for resource-based economies in Africa to move up the value chain. What are the needs in terms of enabling policy and kind of specific financing arrangements for that, building on the excellent work of the African Export-Import Bank, the free trade agreement within Africa, and the AU's new green minerals strategy. We've seen promising signs in Morocco with its work on processing battery minerals, and hopefully that can be replicated elsewhere. Thirdly, getting advanced, some of the major economies to be much more effective at pushing their export credit agencies, pushing their development finance institutions to really focus on critical minerals as an area of focus. We've seen some talk around this, but it's the proportion of financing that's going into this area is still relatively low, and I think governments, across the G7 and beyond, should be focusing much more on that. Fourth, thinking about how we pool subsidies and investments, whether it's the IRA in the US or the European Green Deal or the Japanese Green Industrial Transformation Plan, allowing partner countries to access those where they are participating in the supply chain. Morocco's benefited from that because it has a free trade agreement with the US, but other countries should have easier access to that as well. And lastly, I think crowding in more capital from the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman, given their deep pools of patient capital and existing access and entry into Africa.
All right, thanks, Sean. Professor Makarov, I want to bring you into the conversation. We were talking a little bit earlier about the experience that Russia has transferring itself sort of from a processor of critical minerals outside of the country to inside the country. And that's something that specific countries here are struggling with or are working toward. And so I wanted you to sort of come in with the experience that Russia has on this specific topic and maybe lessons learned that could be applied for other countries that are working towards this exact same outcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm really glad to be a participant of this wonderful forum. Actually, critical metals and minerals are sometimes considered as the new oil. So the demand for it is increasing and it will increase in the future. So for the last 5 years, the demand for critical metals doubled. And by the end of the decade, it will double once again. The concentration of deposits is very high. It is actually much higher than for oil. And it is moreover higher than for oil in times when the OPEC was established. And geopolitical considerations, of course, they play an important role in making decisions about where and how value chains and trade flows are directed. So really, there are a lot of common features between critical metals today and oil in the 20th century. So I came from the country which is rich in old oil. And as long as I remember myself, I remember the discussions in Russia about how to make this shift from just extraction and exporting of oil and other fossil fuels to producing something with more value added. And this is the same type of discussion Africa has now. We had a lot of failures, we had some success, but actually I think that the major lesson that may be derived from the Russian experience is that the new industrialization, it can't be made ad hoc. It can't be made based on separate projects which are isolated from each other. So for this new industrialization, the number of elements should be linked to each other. First, it is elimination of trade barriers, of course, and it is a great step forward for Africa that African continental free trade area was established, which solved, at least to the large extent, solved this problem of trade barriers. It is infrastructure, of course, in order to connect various elements of value chains. It is linking goods to local demand. Industrialization can't be based only on exports. It should be always rooted to the local demand as well. So we have an example of this project between Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia about the development of a hub for battery production. And it is a good example of how it can be linked to the local demand because the batteries are suggested to be produced for 2- and 3-wheeled electric vehicles, which are popular already in Africa and maybe even more popular in future. The fourth element is regional coordination. It is not a matter of one country only. It is a matter of regional cooperation between different countries, and this cooperation and coordination is absolutely necessary. Then, number 5, it is access to finance. So it is a question which I may discuss for next 15 minutes, which I do not have. But still, of course, it is one of the major issues, and it was discussed during this conference many times. And the last, the sixth element, last but not least, it is industrial policy. Local content requirements, some export restrictions, which are already used by many countries in the world, including some African countries related to critical minerals. The major trap here is that there is always a temptation to start with the last element. And it is what was done in some areas and in some periods of time in Russia as well. It does not work like that. So it is like a supplementary measure. It is something which should strengthen other 5 elements, or probably even more, which I did not mention. But it can't be used just as a single solution, as a silver bullet. We may have an example of Indonesia, for example, which was quite successful for the last years in moving forward along the value chain from extraction of nickel to producing batteries, for example. And yes, Indonesia has some export restrictions, and they evolve in time, but these export restrictions, they appeared only when other elements have been built, and only in this case they played its own role. As for Russian companies, of course, Russian companies also participate in this race for critical metals, which was mentioned by Sean. And Russian companies invest in Africa as well, in platinum, uranium, in copper, in bauxites, and in many other types of natural resources. What is usually considered as the competitive advantage by Russian companies, at least how they show it. So it is reliance on the one hand on this Russian experience, which is very painful and which is very, I think, lesson given to the others. And this experience, not so many countries in the world has such experience of struggling with resource curves. And on the other hand, it is of course the reliance on the very rich history of relations between the Soviet Union and Soviet Union with African countries, which also was based on the holistic approach, which included not just taking resources and exploiting the resources of the African continent, but also training, but also exchanging knowledge, but also social assistance and many other things. So what Russian companies try to do now is to re-enter this market based on this history and based on these lessons that may be derived from the past. And of course, we all hope that with participation of foreign companies, not only from Russia, of course, but from China, from Western countries, Africa may become a part of this green industrialization, and not as the provider of just raw materials, but as the full-scale participant, which may deliver and develop its own complicated value chains. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we turn to the audience, we're gonna, John V, I'm gonna come to you, but for the audience, we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions. So get those ready now. I think there's microphones on either side of the room here. So you can go ahead and stand at the microphone so that I can turn right to you as we get to Q&A. But first, I want to come to you because we've talked a lot about the geopolitics of this, the growth of demand for critical raw materials. This is also happening at a time, at a tech boom. And I don't think that you can separate the two. And you've done some work on the tech aspect of this. So can you kind of talk about the tech aspect of that and bring that into the conversation a little bit? Because I think it's a really interesting way to wrap this all together.
Thank you. So, when we start discussing critical minerals in the tech space or in green technologies, digital technologies, the first law that you need to read is Moore's law. That the Moore's law, where the demand for chips increases double every 2 years. So when the demand for chips is increasing, obviously the demand for critical minerals is increasing about 10 times that. For every chip produced, you need 10 times that of the critical minerals involved in the production of that, right? So, and also you can't keep mining forever because Econ 101 resources are limited. So we can't, and there's also the added externality of the sustainability and environmental impact of mining. And we can keep trying to be sustainable when it comes to mining practices, but there is a limitation to that. It is one of the most extractive sectors of the economy, and it has long-term impact for our green futures. So the irony, of course, which we were discussing earlier, is that our green futures are dependent on one of the most polluting sectors of the economy, which is mining. So an area of work that we have really started, we really need to focus more on and research more on is how the circular economy will play into this, and how e-waste, for instance, and e-waste materials can be used to re-extract the critical minerals that have gone into the production of like an old iPad, which we've not thrown away, right? Japan has had some great successes with this. South Korea has some good success with this. I think the most pop culture example is of the Japanese gold medals from their Olympics being extracted from cell phones, from old cell phones. So things like that, if you can do it for cell phones, you can probably reuse it enough to make your next photovoltaic cell, right? But I'm very conscious of the time. So those are the 3 points I wanted to make, that, you know, mining remains an extractive industry. We need to find alternatives to mining to secure supply chains, and e-waste is one of those ways we can do it.
Super interesting. Thank you so much. So I see that there are a couple questions. So if you could go ahead and introduce yourself and preferably make the question short because we don't have that much time left. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Cynthia. I'm from the United States. And thinking about the most vulnerable groups in the climate crisis, a lot of them are indigenous, and simultaneously a lot of critical minerals are located on indigenous land. So I'm curious to hear if you can talk about the equity piece of this as you approach the extraction of minerals that may come from indigenous lands and the inclusion of indigenous voices in this process.
Thank you so much. Is there someone that you wanted specifically to for that question?
Anybody who has insights.
Okay,
Yeah,
so we'll hold that, and then I think there's one more, and then we might just answer these two all at once. You can kind of pick what you'd like to answer. So, sir, go right ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is to, in particular, Bridget Motsepe, because part of this extraction happens through illegal mining, which benefits largely multinational companies that are, based in the global north. And there's ample literature that has been written about the involvement of these multinational companies in facilitating illegal mining and the illicit financial flows that flow out of the host countries. So how do you envisage that the global south should build institutions that are able to hold these big players in particular illegal mining, because it also happens at the exploitation of the indigenous people? And then secondly, how should we effectively combat illicit financial flows that flow particularly from the mining industry? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ambassador, I'll give you 1 second if you want. Does anyone want to answer the question about the indigenous land, indigenous populations? John, go ahead.
So that's an interesting question, right? Because the thing with any resource that is present, the resource cost was mentioned earlier, is about how much of the value is going back to society, how much of the value is going back to the people who technically own these resources. So the interesting thing now is that the UN has guiding principles on resource extraction, and specifically for the energy transition. So it's up to countries now to adapt those principles and to deliver on those principles. But again, like I said, mining remains extractive, and you're really never going to solve that problem of resource extraction and returning value to society as much as it deserves.
Does anyone want to add anything to those thoughts? Okay. Ambassador, I'll turn it over to you.
I'm very happy you spoke about the illegal miners because that's the problem. These illegal miners are very experienced mining people. They've got a lot of expertise that might not be sophisticated, but it's very artisanal. And some of them come from the mines itself, and they were learner miners or they were doing mining work. But the issue here is we shouldn't have allowed the illegal mining syndrome to continue thus far. And unfortunately, we're just waking up too late. However, what we should do, we can turn them into small-scale miners. And by so doing, we are under an obligation in the mining industry to put a percentage of our income into expertise and all, transfer skills and all that. So what we need to do is to have, and I'm now talking about South Africa, that money can then be used by the mining company that's supposed to do rehabilitation. Also, before you build a mine, you have to put a rehabilitation fund aside, and you have to make sure that money is put aside so you can go and rehabilitate. Now, we have embraced the country. We inherit a country where some of the mining companies, especially the big mining companies, might not have rehabilitated properly, but right now, with the country's laws, you have to have a rehabilitation fund. And now, some of that money should actually be used not just by making sure that the police have enough tax money from us to make sure that legal people become legalized. Some of them that are too illegal go to jail, but must also train them and then maybe create small-scale mining opportunities for them. And this is one thing that I'm talking to the Portfolio Committee of Mines, and I'm also talking to the Chamber of Mines about. Let us see how we, the mining industry, can assist. And there's also something called social and labor plan. When we have, before you build a mine, you've got to talk to the local municipality, provincial municipality, and the national government. And then you say, this is my 5-year projection, and this is my mining plan and bankable feasibility study. This is the mine that I want to create. And by so doing, this is what I'm going to create in terms of social and labor plan. And this is the amount of money that I'm going to put aside. Now, that is the money that we can put instead of just the municipality telling you we want roads, and then the mining companies also contribute towards making sure that some of the money that they give for social responsibility, it can then go in partnership with the municipality, and also the 5% that is given by the rural communities, it doesn't go to the chiefs. That 5% that is encumbered in our mining law says not less than 5% shares, dividends must go to rural communities. In one of my mines that I own, we just paid this year to 7 communities that own 7% instead of 5%, 283 million rands dividends. Every year they get money. And some of that money go into building their own roads, their own clinics, their own schools. They don't just wait for government. So I'm saying to them, with the money that also goes not less than 5% to the workers, my workers in one of the mines that I own got 183 million dividends. And some of that money must also go to the league, encompassing the legal miners, so that they can then come and become legalized. So these are the things that we're trying to do to assist with the problems. Illicit capital and transfer pricing. I'm actually the one that went to Parliament a few years ago, and I say to the Portfolio Committee, help me. Every year I get dividends from a partner of mine, and I can't say who the partner is, because the partner will sue me. I had written confidentiality. Then I said, but the minister, you are there. You can ask me privately who the partner is, and I'll tell you. Then you can come back to Parliament and tell who the partner is. I can't. Anyway, every time I get my dividends, I send them back. Why? Because the dividends had taxation money in. And I'm not going to take the dividends that are not allowing the government to pay the tax. And what happens? This partner of mine would then have a marketing company that's offshore listed, and they sell the production from our mine to themselves, and for maybe $1,000 per ton, and then they sell it offshore for the $3,000 per ton. Then they come back to South Africa, and the taxman is told, South African Revenue Services, is told I can't pay tax because my cash flow projection shows a deficit income, And because there's no income, there's no profit. And because there's no profit, there's no tax. They're not saying they are downscaling the share, the price of the commodity to $1,000. Actually, it should have been $3,000. So if they already automatically transferred the commodity from South Africa straight offshore, they would get the 3,000 and bring it off, and they'll show the 3,000 profit, 2,000 profit out of the 1,000 cost of production. You have 2,000 profit of the 3,000, and then you pay tax. And then I said, please do something about it. And then, of course, in that meeting, some of the political people didn't understand, portfolio committees didn't understand what I was talking about. Then they said, no, but you are doing it. I said, no, Anglo Gold Ashanti is not, because they're primarily in South Africa. Impala Platinum is not, because they're primarily in South Africa. SAPI is not. I sit on the board of SAPI with Mayor Bloomberg's advisor, and Heathrow's chairperson also sits on the board, and SAPI, the primary listing in South Africa. So I said, if you have a primary listing in South Africa, you cannot do that because it's negligible even if you do, but you cannot because you are selling, everything happens here, and you don't have an offshore company where you sell to yourself, and then what happened is that I'm very happy that Judge Dennis Davis Commission was created by the Minister of Finance, and President Becky is actually also went further than South Africa to the African Union, and he's actually the chairperson of illicit capital and transfer pricing for the African Union continent. Now, the way forward, we should make sure that even if you mine in the country or you do any business in the country beyond mining, pay tax. Because the government needs the tax to be able to make sure that it invests in all the sectors of the economy and the sectors of the country. Make sure that the illegal miners that are there, to answer your question, become useful. Beyond just putting them in jail, let's make them useful. Let's make sure that because they already have the skills to mine, let's capture their skills. Let's make sure that we fund them, and let's make sure that we put them as broad-based business in terms of the business laws that we have. Not less than 30% must be owned by black people. Let some of those illegal miners also become shareholders in the mining operation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panel.